One of Formula One's works teams is at war with itself, and we probably don't even need to tell you which one. The latest spin of the Wheel of Renault F1 nonsense landed in between Engine HQ goes on strike and trackside protest, and as we all know, the rules of ridiculous fictional game show wheels means both things had to happen, giving Renault's Alpine team probably its oddest embarrassment to deal with yet. Alpine engine employees in France went on strike alongside a protest performed during Friday practice in the grandstands at Monza in opposition to Renault's plan to axe its F1 engine program. Renault bosses want to switch to a customer supply from Mercedes from 2026 after a decision from chairman Luca De Meo to pursue a more cost-effective future. Before that can be finalised though, Renault and Alpine are working through a formal review of what's officially being called a transformation project for Viry-Châtillon, which is where the engine facility is based, which will be redirected to other Alpine and Renault related activities. This has been met with a fierce response by the Alpine Racing Works Council, which we'll refer to as the CSE in this video because that's the French acronym and it's a lot easier to say multiple times. The CSE represents workers at Viry and believes abandoning the French engine would be a betrayal of the original Alpine vision and a disgraceful abandonment of the team's legacy and 50 years of high-tech history and expertise. Punchy stuff, and it's backed up its words with actions already. Around 100 employees went on a trip to Monza organised by the CSE to publicly protest Renault's plan during Friday practice. There were two groups spread across grandstands on the main straight and the exit of Parabolica, displaying a banner while dressed in a white t-shirt with the Alpine logo and the message Viry on track, and wearing a black armband. At the same time, back in France, employees went on strike from 9 AM to 3 PM, backed by local officials in the city. None of the action impacted track operations in any way, but that wasn't the point. It was all about awareness and sending a message. It's still hoped that Renault management will row back on its intention, but as the CSE accuses them of being deaf to any dialogue, that seems unlikely, which means this civil war doesn't have an obvious endpoint. Closing the Renault F1 engine division has been targeted to redirect investment and personnel to other Alpine and Renault Group projects and save a significant amount of money by paying a much lower fee to be a Mercedes customer instead. But the CSE doubts it will help Viry, the Renault Group and Alpine that much beyond saving money. It says the skills of Viry's staff are not really aligned with where innovation in the automotive sector is focused on, which are battery chemistry and industrialization, software-defined vehicles, and autonomous driving. Also, more than 80% of the site's operations are tied to F1, as is its quality and its appeal to workers, who the CSE fears will have no choice but to leave France to continue their F1 careers abroad. It even goes as far as suggesting that this strategy is being deliberately pursued to delay and minimise the impact of an expensive voluntary redundancy plan. Basically, make it so bad staff need to leave so that you don't have to pay them off. The worst thing as far as the CSE is concerned is that it believes the Alpine brand objectives can be achieved while persevering with the F1 engine, even though it has been a big disappointment in the V6 turbo hybrid era. Renault did a bad job with the rule changes that came into force in 2014, and Viry accepts a consistent failure to get on top of that has accounted for approximately 20% of the total performance deficit of the car. But the French side is adamant that the intensive work already conducted for the 2026 engine, which is being built to vastly different rules and a near 50-50 split between internal combustion and electrical power, has yielded a technological breakthrough. Millions of euros have already been invested on exploring more than 100 concepts, nearly one-third of which apparently show promising performance on the test bench and are expected to be incorporated into the 2026 engine. The plan was to integrate this into a test engine by the end of 2024 that is already approaching the expected performance target for 26, hasn't shown any critical reliability failures in testing, and has a 12% reduction in length to improve chassis integration. But instead of being able to persevere with a well-conceived engine with clear potential and pursuing a claimed 0.5 seconds per lap gain from custom integration between chassis and engine, Alpine's Engine HQ is staring down the barrel of what they call a definitive end to Renault's French engine program. It called it a one-way journey with no return, a technological barrier too high to overcome, a brain drain of elite skills, and prohibitively expensive investments. Basically, it will be too expensive and too difficult to return to F1 in the future. One area where the CSE and the management on the Enstone side of Alpine are kind of aligned is in claiming the F1 team's been badly run. But they disagree on who is to blame for that. Viry clearly feels it's chairman Luca De Meo's responsibility, while De Meo appointments Flavio Briatore and new team principal Oliver Oakes are leaping to his defence. Alpine started the ground effect era brightly in 2022, finishing 4th in the Constructors' Championship. It slipped to 6th last year and only has 13 points from 16 race weekends so far in 2024, leaving it a disappointing 8th in the standings. In that time, Renault has made a host of changes to the composition of this F1 team, including but not limited to Laurent Rossi being replaced as Alpine CEO, team principal Otmar Szafnauer being removed from his role and replaced by then Viry boss Bruno Famin, who also had a broader role as vice president of Alpine Motorsport, and technical chiefs Pat Fry and Matt Harmon resigning in 2023 and 2024 respectively. Famin's been shuffled back into a Viry-only role after stepping down as team principal in August. There is a technical director at Viry again, Eric Menyon, who joined last October. Before him, Famin was executive director at Viry. Yes, he has worn a lot of hats after replacing longtime engine boss Remy Taffin. Basically, chaos. But while the CSE blames the Renault Group's destabilising interference with the entire project, Briatore believes Alpine's decline is because of a few wrong managers, while Oaks likewise emphasises the fault of the leadership before. Briatore's been hired to be De Meo's F1 executive advisor, and Oaks is the new team principal, so they are now responsible for turning things around at Enstone, and as De Meo recruits, they are inevitably on his side. Briatore, who ran Enstone to world titles in the early 90s as Benetton and as Renault in the mid-2000s, said this was the first time he'd had such big support from Renault in all his dealings with the company. Oaks said it's not right that De Meo has been blamed for Alpine's failings, and that there's too much rubbish written in the press today which just isn't completely true. Well, get ready for more rubbish, because we struggle to believe that De Meo is completely unaccountable for this. If various personnel really have mismanaged Alpine on different levels, then it was De Meo who put at least some of them in charge. While he didn't personally recruit jobs like the technical director, he must have been instrumental in Rossi becoming Alpine CEO, Szafnauer being made team principal, and Famin being appointed to his various positions. And if all of those failed in one way or another, at some point the buck must stop with the big boss at Renault, so De Meo has to bear some responsibility for the problems that it's had. So as the Alpine broom gets yet another head and handle, is anything going to change? As we said, Briatore is a senior figure in Renault's F1 operation again, some 15 years after leaving in the wake of the Singapore Crashgate scandal, after being rehired a couple of months ago by De Meo. And Oaks took charge as team principal for the first time at the Dutch Grand Prix after the August break. Briatore believes significant action was required to revitalise the system, stating that Alpine needed an electric shock. Oaks added in response that he calls it the Flavio Tornado. They are nice lines, but what do they mean in reality? Briatore has named a specific target of scoring some podiums in 2027, but this feels different to past Alpine and Renault mistakes in terms of public declarations. It's broader than the ill-fated 100-race plan of the Rossi-Szafnauer era, the starting point for which was then changed. Regardless of when it actually started, it was preceded by a 5-year plan when Renault re-entered F1 in 2016 to fight for world championships, that Renault is probably going to need to double and then add a few more years to. The Renault F1 projects had so many timelines, and this has felt like the darkest one for a while. But the new ambition at least seems rooted in the current reality. Alpine was previously scoring the odd podium, it slipped a long way from that, so it needs to recover, and it might take a long time to do so. The emphasis is apparently going to be on trying to improve as much as possible year after year, which is how it should be, but pretty obviously not how Renault's allowed it to be. Nothing has happened quickly enough, and nothing's been good enough. So it depends whether Briatore and Oaks have the time and, crucially, the authority to make the changes that are necessary. And if Alpine's fortunes are going to improve, it won't be because of massive new investment. Although there's been a lot of turnover in the senior leadership, and Alpine's bled some other staff to rivals, Briatore's speaking as though significant recruitment is unlikely. When he outlined all that is needed to be successful in F1, he suggested that total staff number is a red herring. This was consistent with a strong message from both him and Oaks that the existing workforce is capable of achieving a lot more than it has so far. Returning to the engine programme, Briatore's backed the rationale for abandoning Renault's own power unit for 2026 by pointing to its relatively rubbish record in the V6 turbo hybrid era. But he's insisted that the company had determined that the immense expense wasn't worthwhile before he arrived. If true, which a lot of people in the paddock don't believe is the case, then it can only be De Meo's idea to willingly sacrifice works team status, and we've made pretty clear in previous videos how stupid we think that is. That decision might help in the short term, but it ultimately limits Renault's potential and has raised question marks over its commitment. We've also made it clear that all signs point to the company selling this team eventually, and we're not the only ones that think that. Speak to senior figures at Alpine and they inevitably disagree. Briatore says it's not the case and joked that if anything, they want to buy another F1 team if they could. He said emphatically, Luca De Meo never wants to sell the team, question finito. And that's what Enstone workers have been told as well. Fair enough, but if it's really finito, why take all the steps that someone would if they were going to sell at some point, and why are potential investors allegedly being offered a way to get a stake in the F1 team? That's what 2016 world champion Nico Rosberg claimed at the Italian Grand Prix. In his role as a Sky Sports F1 pundit, Rosberg said he'd had an email offering him a chance to invest in Alpine, which sounds quite surprising, but it wasn't as clear as someone trying to sell the team, especially to a former F1 driver. Remember, Renault already sold a 24% stake to a US consortium last year. Apparently, it's the shares within that stake that could be sold to new investors. So, minor movement within the existing consortium rather than Renault trying to offload the team entirely. Something we're happy to clarify on Alpine's behalf, as it continues to reiterate that the team is not for sale. But there's so much uncertainty around so many aspects of this entire operation, we're really not convinced this team will still be in Renault's hands by the end of its latest timeline for success.